There's a great podcast I'm listening to that I want to share with you before today's episode. It's called Reframables. Two very different sisters, one artist, entrepreneur, one teacher, philosopher, worked through some of their lives' biggest hurdles through conversations with artists, thinkers, and creators who are doing that kind of work in the world. This sister duo, Natalie and Rebecca Davey, aim to better themselves and the world they love through art, philosophy, humor, and lived experience. Their conversations with each other and their guests are vulnerable, honest, and wise. Every episode, they share bite-sized reframables for listeners to chew on for the rest of the week. At the end of this episode, I'll include the trailer to the show. You can find reframables wherever you listen to podcasts and at their website, seriesproductions.ca/reframables. Do you want to change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel.
You gotta be scared, right?
Fucking I'm scared. You know, I'm here, my whole theory, gotta do it. I know I gotta do it, but man, when you really gotta do it.
I just want you around and I don't want you to do it.
Today we're talking about the documentary film, Jack Has a Plan. This film takes on a topic that, in this culture at least, is still pretty taboo. Are we able to talk about death? Are we able to talk about our own death? When we know that a loved one is facing death, how does that feel to talk to them about it openly? With a brain tumor and increased debilitation, physically and especially cognitively, Jack Tuller decided to exercise his right to end his life on his terms under the recently passed law in California called the End of Life Option Act. This law gives someone with less than 6 months to live from a terminal disease the right to choose to end their life before pain, suffering, and debilitation ends their life for them. When you're going to die soon, anyway, this law gives you the choice to do so on your own terms. But it's also a film about so much more than that. For 26 years, Jack Tuller lived with a brain tumor. He lived those years fully and joyfully. This film isn't just a story of his death. It's the story of a life. It's a story about relationships between a husband and wife, between parents and their child. Maybe, mostly, it's a story about friendship. Because Jack asked his friend, Bradley Berman, to document the story of his life after making this decision to exercise his right to die with dignity. How do you make a film documenting your friend's end of life? You love your friend, and you want to support him however you can. But the truth is, you really, really don't want him to go. This is a film about the absolute joy of being alive, of experiencing love, passion, humor, music, food, wine, the warmth of family and friends, and celebrating the life that you have and embracing the fact that you have choices. To be very clear, this film is not about suicide. If you are listening to this and have thoughts of harming yourself, I'll provide resources to reach out to in the show notes. Bradley Berman is a filmmaker and writer who regularly contributes to the New York Times, MIT Technology Review, Popular Mechanics, and U.S. News and World Report. The film we'll be talking about today, Jack Has a Plan, was produced by Chris Metzler and edited by Quinn Costello. It all began when Jack Tuller asked Bradley, one of his closest friends, to document the last 3 years of his life, a time when the brain tumor he'd been living with for the past 2 decades began to seriously impact his physical and cognitive abilities. Knowing that he had a brain tumor that would eventually end his life, Jack made the most of it with a beautiful wife, dear friends, and family. In keeping with his idea that life should be lived to the fullest, Jack also intended to end his life with dignity, while he could still recognize and appreciate those that he loved. He spent his last weeks of life meeting with friends, telling them how much he appreciated them. And shortly before the time he had chosen to die peacefully at home, he hosted a gathering of his nearest and dearest friends to celebrate their role in his life one last time. I've asked Bradley Berman to join us on this episode to talk about what this process was like as a filmmaker and as Jack's friend. Hi, Brad. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by telling us who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. My name is Bradley Berman. I am a filmmaker and a writer and have been involved in all kinds of creative art projects for all of my adult life, really, for the past 30 years or so, in all different types of forms.
Okay, well, today we're going to talk about something that you finished fairly recently, I think, a film, Jack Has a Plan. And I'm hoping that you can introduce the film. What is this film about?
It's a story of my very dear friend who has a wild background. He was diagnosed at age 32 with a terminal brain tumor. Sounds pretty severe, right? He was given 6 months to live, but he lived for 25 years.
Wow.
I knew him right after his first surgery. I wasn't there for the first encounter with cancer and his first surgery, but I met him soon after and we became fast friends. And then he spent quite a bit of time coming back to what might be considered a normal life, but all the while having a pretty strong sense of his own mortality. The film starts in 2016 after more than 20 years past that first diagnosis.
Wow.
And at that point, he had gone through a second surgery and was starting to decline in various ways that we can discuss. At that point, he could see over the horizon. He could see that he was more strongly, more imminently facing his demise and wanted to document those last few years while he prepared to make his exit. So that's what the film is. Let me be clear. Jack wanted this. Jack wanted this film made. He is as much the author and creator of it as I am. And he wanted his story to be told and to leave a legacy and to show other people in the same predicament or how to approach that, how he was approaching it.
Mm.
The first time we turned on the camera, he started humming, "Don't worry, be happy." So that kind of gives you a little bit of an indication.
Well, I would love to hear just a little more detail from your perspective. What was it like for you when he asked you to document this portion of his life? What did you think?
I did not want to do it. I resisted. I had just finished a previous film project and he went to the premiere and he was one of these rare friends that very few of us have. And I don't think I've ever encountered other than with Jack. I mean, I have good friends. I'm blessed with that. But Jack had many, many good friends and he constantly built you up. He constantly praised you and encouraged you and admired you. He would call out of the blue facing these dire situations and But after, I would say, Jack, how are you? How are you feeling? And he would explain a little bit of the crazy things he was going through, hearing voices in his head and trumpets and getting lost and not being able to read menus. And as he said in the film, like putting soap in, did he just do crazy things because of the rewiring of his brain? But within a few minutes, he would say, enough about me, let me talk about you. So he was
Mm.
always very concerned about other people. But get back to your question, I didn't want to know if I wanted to bear witness, put it that way, to his demise, right? And
Mm.
I didn't know, like, when nobody at that point knew how long he would last, right? He was given 6 months to live, but he was outliving all of us, outliving other friends. So I didn't really want to do it at first. And then he wore me down to the point where I said, okay, let's just turn the camera on and see what happens.
Well, I think in order to really understand what we're talking about when we talk about this film, we
Mhm.
have to be more specific when we say the name of the film is Jack Has a Plan. What was his plan?
His plan was to die happy. His plan was to not suffer, to know that his capabilities were going to diminish and he was going to become more ill. But his plan was to navigate the medical system and his life and his relationships in a way that he didn't suffer and he didn't burden other people around him with suffering. He didn't necessarily know exactly how that plan was going to play out. It was a certain kind of Zen attitude, or he loved jazz music, and we used that through the film. It was he used to call it the jazz life. You wing it. Like, we had no script, we had no treatment, we had, on any given day, there was no necessarily a set plan of what we were going to shoot or what we were going to talk about. It was a hang session, one after the next. But slowly it emerged, and it was almost like in a sly way, he had something in the back of his mind, because he, Pam, this conversation is going to quickly get into some heavy stuff about death and dying, right? And I
Yeah,
mean, and that's the kind of the meta plan, if you will, that Jack had, was to discuss death, to do it in a way with humor and humility. And that's as far as it had to go. Like, let's talk about it. He was kind of odd in the sense that he would meet strangers on the street. He'd walk his dog and he'd meet strangers, and he would start talking about his terminal brain tumor within 2 or 3 minutes. And
wow.
he was just so open about it. So that was kind of the first plan he had, was to get me to start shooting, and to get his thoughts down, to get his ideas about, like, we're all going to face that, right? We're all going to face death. We're all impermanent and mortal. But he wanted to share his thoughts about that. He had a lot of time to think about it. He had 25 years from this terminal diagnosis until he actually passed. He had decades to think about it, to study it. And so the first level of his plan was just like, let's break down the taboo, let's be open, and let's talk about it. And then within a few months of shooting, California passed the End of Life Options Act. He wasn't aware of that when we started. Even well into the project, he was calling Switzerland, because that's a place where people go to. There's very supportive there. You can go and travel there, and they will assist you in dying. Okay.
Right.
Now let's be clear. All of these programs require that two doctors, or let's say sort of the best practices medical establishment, determines that you are terminal and that you will die within 6 months.
Mm.
So it's not like people just deciding to die because some other reason. They're already going to die.
Right.
And the ability to choose when we do that and how we do that, and if we have a quote unquote good death or a bad death, because there are those things, that's what's being made possible through these new laws that allow us to decide if we're going to wait to the bitter end and suffer. death is a gut punch to anybody. Anybody who's experienced a loss of a loved one knows that it's a punch right to the gut. But when you have an opportunity, if we're so lucky to have a plan for it and to even possibly set the date, it transforms the entire experience.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I first heard about this film, I had misgivings about watching it because I
Sure.
realized as I watched it that I had some fairly rigid ideas about whether or not I thought this was a good idea. And I am so glad I watched the film. I came away with a different perspective, but I'm hoping that you can sort of play that person who talks about this perspective of why I think it's often referred to as death with dignity, why that is something that people should not be afraid of or should perhaps open their minds to. Do you feel like that's something that you could talk about?
I can try.
Sure.
This was never conceived of as an advocacy film.
Right.
This was not a social, I mean, it's an important social issue, but I never thought of it or approached it as, okay, let me, in a didactic way, explain what this law is and who qualifies. And this is a story, right? This is a story about relationships, and it's kind of a quest, right? It's in a way, it's a kind of a buddy film at the same time, because Jack sits in the middle of a whole set of very close friends and a loving marriage as well. So I'm happy to talk about those issues, but I want to be clear for folks because I want everybody to see this. Obviously, it's a ride, it's a story, it's almost like a dramatic piece, right?
Right.
And that's how it was intended.
Well, I just want to interject here that
Sure.
a really gripping emotional story like this is the best way to open your mind. So, yes, it is very much a story worth seeing no matter what your perspective is on this issue, because it goes much beyond the issue of death with dignity or planned death when you have a terminal diagnosis.
Right. So you're asking, why should people have this right? Or why people should not be resistant to this law?
I would love for you to explain what you personally came to understand about this decision that your friend made. And because really that's all I can ask of you is
Sure.
your personal experience of it.
Well, one aspect of it is, first of all, you can have two thoughts and feelings at the same time. You can be deeply saddened by the fact that someone you love is going to pass, right? Is going to die, right? Not to use any euphemisms. You can be very sad about that. At the same time, you can respect their opinions, their heartfelt feelings about the way they want to go and when they want to go. Okay. I mean, that's sort of the central narrative of the story, is the resistance that people all around him have to him making this decision, because he makes the decision in the open, vocal. I mean, he's living it, man. He embraces this feeling. Like, he didn't have a bucket list, for example, right? He traveled the world. I mean, think about this, Pam. If you were given 6 months to live in your early 30s and now you're in your late 50s, he would always say, I never think, woe is me. Or he would say, a lot of times people would say, why me? Why me? And he would always say, well, why not me? Right? He felt like he was given a gift of those extra 2.5 decades. So he enjoyed that gift. He enjoyed the experience. And when the quality of his life became diminished, I mean, he did have what the doctors called major neurocognitive disorder, right?
Mm.
He had constant ringing in his ears. Towards the end now, he had an involuntary eye closure where he was essentially blind for anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours to a day almost, where he couldn't get his eyes open. It's just crazy. And there were other symptoms. So we all have a line, okay, that we don't want to cross. I mean, in my readings on this topic, people, they draw it in different ways, or like in Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, which I highly recommend. There's a lot of great books out there. The Day I Die is another one I just read that's very good. So some people, if they can't play tennis, they're like, life is not worth living. For some people, if I can't watch movies, if I'm in a wheelchair, life isn't worth living. Now, those are all, come on, like that's, no one ends their life early because they can't play tennis or do something like that. But for him, like dignity was being able to go to the bathroom by himself. So he knew where he drew the line and he was sticking with it. And so a lot of what not only me, but others came to see is like, he's clear headed. He knows what his plan is. And we can accept it or not, but that's his plan and that's his right.
Mm. It's a lot to ponder because you think about so many people who actually do live the way that he said he didn't want to live and who still enjoy their lives, find quality of lives. But as you said, it's very much his individual decision to make. And you said he didn't have a bucket list, but it does seem like in the film he had some loose ends he wanted to tie up, which is a huge part of the film.
Yes.
And that had to do with his parents. Can you talk a little bit about this? And, you know, that's a major part of the film. And it's actually one of the most wonderful parts of the film in terms of, well, half of it.
Yeah. Let me also just be clear that he never proselytized. He said, this is my choice. This is how I would do it. You could do it differently.
Right.
He had a troubled upbringing. He grew up with a mother who didn't love him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was estranged from his mother before the time of his first surgery. So she didn't even know that he had that. By that time, he was a young man and he was like, I don't want her around for this traumatic thing. You know, I have a lot of people who love me, my sort of found family versus my blood family. And he didn't want her around. But as he approached it was 2 years before he died, he said, look, let me connect with her. Let me just reach out to her. It's been more than 20 years. You know, it's all a part of the same idea that the empowerment that takes place when you decide your own destiny, when you're a terminal person and you're able to say, I know when I'm going to pass. 2 doctors have already told me I've only have 6 months to live, or for him, it was even earlier. He said he sort of intuited like when he was on the way down, he said, let me reconcile. Let me give it one last try. Let me just tell her I appreciate that she brought me into this world. Let me seek her out and hopefully things will work out and I can tie up that loose end. I'm going to reach out to my mom. And then at the same time, he had not known his biological father. He was separated from his biological father from the time he was 3 months old. So he wanted to see if he could find his biological father. And I was able to witness the reconciling of father and son. Kind of gives me chills even thinking about it. I was able to witness the reconnection and reconciling of a father and son who were separated for 55 years. And when they come together, it's something.
That was really beautiful. And on the one hand, you can think of it as very sad because they didn't have a lot of time together. But I think the fact that he had not gotten that kind of unconditional love from his mother and the joy and the love from both his biological father and his biological father's wife, there was so much love there that, you know, it was really truly one of the many, many high points of the film.
He had personal visits. Okay, when he set the date, August 30th, 2019, he set the date maybe, I forget what it was, maybe almost a month before. You could say that's excruciating, right?
Right. It never gets ugly. It never severs any relationships. There are people who say up until the very end, don't do it, don't go, don't do it, don't go. But the love that he has with these people is not affected by that.
No. Yeah, so I was there. So the way the party took place, so he was able to schedule visits with friends, all like in those last few weeks. In other words, 9 o'clock, Pam would come visit, and 11 o'clock, someone else would come visit, and 2 o'clock, Pete would, whoever it is would come visit. So he was had quality time, one-on-one, to spend with a lot of different people over the course of weeks. Okay, some people, they prefer to do it that way than to be there at the very end. But regardless, he gave everybody that opportunity, and he had it for himself. He was able to see family and friends one-on-one, like, at a party, so to speak. I mean, calling it a party is an odd thing. A group gathering, people are busy. Sometimes you kind of, the vagaries of weaving in and out and mingling with people. You spend more time with some people than other times. And then another party later on, maybe you spend more time with other people just by chance. He wanted the ability to spend time with everybody in a really
Mm.
quality way. And what was it about? Why did he want to do that? To express gratitude,
Mm.
appreciation, love, generosity. He wanted to say how much they meant to him. And he was able to get that kind of closure with dozens and dozens of people. And then on the last day, a smaller group got together, and one by one, they also said goodbye and left. And I was lucky enough, I mean, partly because of this project, perhaps, to be one of the last people before he was left with his wife. And like for the last hour or two, it was just Jack and Jennifer.
Mm.
So, and then a bunch of us, all left together and went to the corner bar and had a few stiff drinks and kind of waited to see when we would get the word from Jennifer that he had sailed away.
Mm. When you're describing this idea of being able to express gratitude to all of the people in your life who mean something to you, it's a really powerful thing to be able to do that. And that was one of the things too that it seemed like, I mean, we're talking a lot about the physical aspects that he didn't want to get beyond, but it also did sound like there were certain emotional and cognitive things that he didn't want to be at the end and not be able to recognize friends or participate in relationships the way that he had. So that seemed to be like a huge part as well for him.
Huge. If he had a different kind of illness, it would be different. He had an illness, he had a brain tumor, and his memory was declining. And he was said many times for many years, I don't want to reach a point where I don't appreciate how wonderful and beautiful this life is. I don't want to see my wife, my friends, and not recognize them.
Mm.
And at the same time, just the way the law works, someone has to be of sound mind and make cogent, clear decisions. I mean, you have to ask that person, and the doctors are evaluating and watching very carefully, are they making this decision on their own? And so it was kind of a race against the clock in a certain way, because
Right.
if he had reached a point where he was no longer aware of his surroundings and aware of the magnitude of the decision that he was making, even though maybe some of us question whether he was even when he did, but I don't want to give people the impression that this film shows somebody who is like bandaged up and in an ICU. Like the thing that's remarkable, I think, of the story that we were able to capture is that it's not medicalized. It's not in an ICU. There's been a lot of other films that try to capture that have been effective in showing end of life, but it looks very dire. They're in a bed, and like Jack was making jokes up until the very last moments. I mean,
Right.
when the pharmacists come in to deliver, it's not in the film, but when the pharmacists come in to deliver the medicine, they give it to him and they explain all the details. I mean, we show that. We show that this is how it works. This is what you do. This is how you mix it. And then this is how long, this is what to expect. And he's, his eyes were closed at that point, and he's asking questions. Well, how do I do this? What will I experience? How will I know? He was so aware. And then when they
Right.
went to go leave, he said, "Thank you so much for providing all this great information. I've never done this before."
Well, I think sort of resting with this thought that he definitely seemed to be someone who loved his life. He loved his life, and what he loved about it were the people who were important to him. And even though this was very much his individual decision. That's who he prioritized at the end. And that was the part of his life that he didn't want to give up in terms of not being completely there cognitively anymore to experience that.
Exactly. And he also wanted this film to be made as a gift to me, for example, but a gift to, I mean, what's beautiful to see now is we show it around the country. We've been to 4 film festivals so far. The response has been amazing. We have 8 or 9 more lined up and probably more after that. We have a lot of community screenings as well. We have an impact campaign going on where we're networking with people in the medical aid and dying field. There's an entire field, there's almost a movement, Pam. There's a movement of people who are trying to reimagine end of life. And with the demographics of this country, the way we're facing the graying of the baby boom, the baby boomers, like we need to rethink how this works.
Mm-hmm.
So the film is really, as one reviewer said, he said, if there's an art to dying, then Jack Tuller is Picasso. Like he gave it as a gift to all these audiences, anybody facing this, to say, here's a model, here's a, not that you have to follow, but here's a way to approach this in a way that's kind of more enlightened, more recognizing of the impermanence of life, and that's more life affirming.
Right, right. Well, my last question is, how has your grieving process gone over the loss of Jack? Did it start long before because of his diagnosis? Did the film help, or what would you say?
When he passed, by that time we had built up maybe, I've never really tallied it, but maybe 50 or 60 hours of footage. The film is 73 minutes. So I knew that we wanted to make some kind of film about this. Well, I didn't fully know whether this would have meaning for people other than me and his friends. That was the first audience, right? Just maybe it's just like a home movie for us,
Right.
right? So I just could not, in terms of grieving, I could not look at a single frame of footage for a full year. I mean, I would
Yeah.
try. I would like, okay, maybe today's the day, and it would be 3 weeks later. No, I just can't. 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months. Glance at like 30 seconds. No, I can't do it. But then on the 1 year anniversary of his passing, I started digging into I said, okay, now's the time. I got to do it now. And so I started, as a filmmaker yourself, how many, like you're watching footage over and over and over and over again. So I really spent the last few years with him. I mean, it was like he was right there. All our
Mm,
goofy jokes, inside jokes, most of which, nearly all, that we're trying to tell a story, not just make this some inside joke between Jack and me. So it was an intense way to grieve, because I don't think most people grieve with intention. Like we might want to grieve in a way like, I want to get over this. Like, this is painful. I want this pain to be over. I don't know how much awareness we have of these things as we're going through it. But for me, it was, I want to tell a story and make sense of these many, many hours of time we spent together. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I mean, a lot of people say, oh man, like that must have been tough. I mean, yeah, there were a lot of tears in the editing room, but at the same time, it was fun. Like the same fun that he wanted any experience to be when you were just with him, because he was goofy and he was fun and he danced and we'd have a good time. So that came through in the footage. And so it was kind of fun to figure that out. And I'd be remiss not to express great appreciation and gratitude for Chris Metzler, the producer of the film, for Quinn Costello, one of the editors, and for Byron Thompson, the other editor, because they helped me. Not only did I have a chance to watch the footage and try to shape it into, after a full year of, I had a rough cut and I felt like the story was there, but I started sharing it with Chris and other people, and he helped me show rough cut screenings and things like that. So the filmmaking process was in a way a kind of grieving process, but more than that, it was about trying to be faithful and honest with Jack's story and fulfill his request to have something out there in the world that would be a legacy for what he went through.
Yeah, yeah. Well, tell us where we can find out more about the film. Where might people see this film?
If you go to jackdocumentary.com or to facebook.com/jackdocumentary, that's where you can keep track of it.
Oh, great. Great. Thank you so much
Thanks,
for
Pam.
being and talking about this. It's a really powerful, mind-shifting film, at least for me. And I think it will be for a lot of people. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you to Bradley Berman for coming on this episode to talk about the making of Jack Has a Plan. If you are in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's an opportunity to see this film with the creators on Saturday, October 1st, 2022 at the Clarion Performing Arts Center. I'll put a link in the show notes on where to find tickets for the event. I'd love to hear from listeners about how you feel about this choice to die with dignity. Do you have a similar law where you live? Maybe you have complex feelings about it, as I did before seeing the film. Finally, if you are having thoughts of suicide or harming yourself, please call 988, the Suicide and Crisis Hotline here in the United States. Thank you for listening to this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. If you're enjoying this show, I'd love your support. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and share this show with a friend. And especially, reach out on social media. I'd love to hear from you. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Ketsa and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. Art Heals All Wounds comes to you from Oakland, California, on unceded territory of the Choqueño Ohlone people.
Dear Reframables, welcome to our podcast.
I'm Nat.
And I'm Beck.
Two very different sisters who try to reorient life through the stories we tell.
We call it reframing.
Sometimes we do it through conversations, just the two of us.
And sometimes we bring in artists, thinkers, and creators to help us along.
Always, we like to leave you with some new reframable to chew on
as we work through life's big and small stuff together.